Title: Arab millionaire locked his new wife in the basement. What happened next will shock you. Hook. Trapped in a basement with a dark secret, a woman finds herself locked in a deadly game of survival. But when she unlocks a terrifying mystery, everything changes. Will she escape or become part of something far worse? Stay with us to uncover the chilling truth. Watch until the end, because nothing is what it seems. The air was thick with silence. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, gazing up at the narrow passage that led to the rest of the house. A faint light flickered above her, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her chest. The basement smelled of damp concrete and something unfamiliar. She shivered, her fingers brushing the cold metal doorframe. The sound of the house settling above her made her flinch. It had been hours since she last heard his footsteps. At first, she had tried to settle into the new space, but it wasn't easy. The basement felt like a tomb. The walls were bare, except for a few rusted pipes snaking across them. The only window was small, covered in grime, and too high to reach. Every night, he would lock her in. He said it was for her own safety. But she didn't believe him. Her mind raced with possibilities. What if he wasn't coming back? What if he never let her out? The basement was suffocating. She paced back and forth, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Her thoughts were clouded by a mix of fear and confusion. Why had he brought her here? He had promised her a life of luxury. But all she had now was cold concrete, isolation, and darkness. The distant sound of a door creaking above made her freeze. She held her breath, listening intently. Footsteps. Her heart skipped. They were slow, deliberate. Someone was coming down. Her pulse quickened as the footsteps grew louder. The door at the top of the stairs slowly creaked open. The figure at the top was shrouded in darkness. She could barely make out his outline, but she knew who it was. It was him. He stood at the top of the stairs, staring down at her. His eyes were cold, unreadable. She swallowed, fighting back the surge of panic rising in her chest. "You've been a good girl, haven't you?" His voice was low, but carried an edge of something darker. She didn't answer. She couldn't. He stepped closer to the top of the stairs, the floorboards groaning under his weight. She could feel his presence, heavy and overwhelming. He had locked her in. He had isolated her. She had no way out. His gaze never left her. He took another step down. The darkness around her seemed to close in. She could hear his breath, slow and measured. Her pulse raced in her ears. What did he want? Why had he brought her here? She dared not speak. The air felt thicker now, heavy with anticipation. His footsteps echoed, each one making the silence more unbearable. She tried to back away, but the basement walls were too close, too oppressive. Her eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but there was none. "You're mine now," he whispered, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. She froze, her stomach turned. The basement felt even colder than before. He took another step, then another, moving closer to her. She felt trapped, suffocated. Her mind screamed for a way out, but there was no way out. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs now, only a few feet away. She could smell his cologne, sharp and overpowering. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek. She flinched, her skin crawling. "Don't worry," he said, his voice smooth but chilling. "You'll get used to it." His hand dropped to his side, and he turned to leave. The basement door clicked shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver through her spine. The darkness returned, swallowing her whole. She stood there, frozen, her mind racing. Was she truly alone? The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of his words. The silence was almost suffocating. Then she heard it, a sound, faint but distinct, a tapping. a rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the room. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes darted to the sound. It was coming from behind the old wooden crate. She hadn't noticed it before. The tapping continued, soft at first, then louder. It was no longer a question. She had to know what it was. With trembling hands, she moved toward the crate. The sound grew faster, more urgent. Her fingers brushed against the rough surface of the crate. And then she stopped. There, at the corner of her eye, a shadow shifted. A figure slightly hunched, but unmistakably there. Her heart pounded. Who was it? Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move, but the presence was undeniable. It was as if the shadow itself had come to life. She stood frozen, her body betraying her with tremors. The tapping ceased, and for a moment, everything was silent. Her mind raced. What was happening? Was it real, or was she imagining things? The shadow didn't move, but it felt closer, like it was watching her, waiting. Her hand hovered over the crate, still unsure whether she should touch it. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached for the edge of the crate. Her fingers brushed against the rough wood again. This time, it felt different. The crate was warm, her pulse spiked, and a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She didn't know what to expect. With a quick motion, she yanked open the crate. Inside, it was dark, but she could see a faint glimmer of something shiny, something small, nestled among torn cloth and old newspapers. She reached inside, her hand trembling. As her fingers closed around the object, the door to the basement slammed open. A cold rush of air filled the room, blowing the small piece of shiny metal from her hand. She whipped her head around. There, standing in the doorway, was the man, the Arab millionaire, but his face wasn't the same. His eyes were wild, almost feral. He was breathing heavily, his mouth twisted in an expression of fury. "You shouldn't have touched it," he hissed. Her stomach dropped. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice shaky. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he took a step toward her, his eyes fixed on the crate. "That thing, it's not for you," he said, his voice low, dangerous. He reached into the crate with a swift motion, pulling out the shiny object. It was a small, ornate key. He looked at it for a moment, then shoved it into his pocket, as if hiding it from her. "You don't understand what you've done," he muttered, his gaze flickering to the shadows behind him. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. Then, with a sudden movement, he turned and headed toward the stairs. Before she could speak, he stopped. "You'll stay here," he said, his voice cold as ice. "And you'll never ask about it again." With that, he disappeared up the stairs, leaving her alone in the dark once more. Her mind spun, the weight of his words sinking in. What was that key? And why had he gone to such lengths to keep it from her? She glanced back at the crate, at the place where it had been. But there was no key now. Nothing but empty space. She stood there, shaking. Then she heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it wasn't coming from the crate. It was coming from the shadows. The tapping echoed through the basement, sharp and relentless. It wasn't the same rhythmic sound as before. It was faster, almost frantic. Her breath caught as she turned toward the source. The shadows seemed to shift, darker and more oppressive. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back. Each tap was like a drumbeat, closer, louder. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. The basement felt alive now, the very air thick with tension. Suddenly, a whisper broke through the silence. A low, guttural voice. It wasn't the man's voice. It was something darker. "Leave now," the voice rasped, like dry leaves in the wind. Her blood ran cold. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The tapping had stopped, but the voice lingered in the air, heavy and threatening. Her mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of it. Was it a trick of her mind, or was something else in this basement with her? The whisper came again, louder this time. Leave now. Her legs shook as the urge to flee gripped her, but the door at the top of the stairs was locked. She was trapped. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the stillness. Something had fallen behind her. She whipped around, heart hammering in her chest. A figure stood in the shadows now, tall, with glowing eyes that pierced through the dark. Her throat tightened, her body frozen in fear. The figure moved forward, its shape becoming clearer with each step. It wasn't human. It was something far worse. Her eyes widened as it neared. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its skeletal frame. The air grew colder still, and she could see her breath misting in front of her. It stopped just a few feet away, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. The voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just in the air. It was inside her head. "You're not alone." She took a step back, panic rising in her chest. Her fingers brushed against the wall as she tried to make sense of what was happening. But then the figure spoke, its voice a hiss, more unsettling than any whisper. "You're in my world now." The words sent a shock through her body. A cold, bone-chilling realization washed over her. The tapping had been its warning, and she had ignored it. She had touched the key. The figure took another step forward, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the air thickened around her. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within the creature's throat. It was as though the basement itself was alive, pulsing with dark energy. The shadows around her seemed to bend and twist, drawn to the figure like moths to a flame. Her heart raced, each beat pounding in her chest like a drum. Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure cocked its head, an eerie, almost playful gesture. "Why do you think?" it hissed, its voice like nails scraping against stone. "You released me." Her eyes widened in horror as she realized the truth. The key, the object the man had hidden so carefully. It had been a prison, keeping something ancient and dangerous at bay. And now that thing was free. "You didn't know," the figure whispered again, "but it doesn't matter." It raised its hand, long, skeletal fingers curling toward her. The room grew colder, colder than she had ever felt before. A biting frost crept up her spine, freezing her in place. Her breath turned to ice as she struggled to move, to run, but her legs refused to obey. "Do you feel it?" the creature crooned, its voice softer now, almost seductive. The shadows seemed to close in tighter around her, suffocating her. The walls felt like they were closing in, pushing her toward the creature. It reached out, its hand just inches from her face. She could see the details now, its skin tight and translucent, almost translucent as it clung to the bone. Its eyes were full of hunger, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "You're mine now," it murmured, its lips brushing her ear. A chill ran through her body as the full weight of its words sank in. Her mind screamed for her to fight, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But she couldn't. She was paralyzed. The creature leaned closer, its breath cold as ice on her skin. The basement was no longer just a room. It was a trap, and she had walked right into it. The creature's icy breath stung her skin as it leaned closer, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. Her heart hammered in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to move, to escape. But her body betrayed her, frozen in place by the overwhelming terror. It grinned, exposing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You should have listened," it whispered, its voice a haunting rasp. "Now you belong to me." The words echoed in her mind, louder than her racing heartbeat. With a swift motion, its cold fingers curled around her wrist, its grip like iron. A searing cold shot up her arm, the pain blinding. She gasped, the freezing sensation spreading through her body, seeping into her very bones. Her legs finally gave way, but the creature held her firmly in place, its grip unyielding. "Let me go!" she cried out, her voice breaking, raw with fear. But it only chuckled a low, cruel sound that vibrated in the pit of her stomach. "You have no choice," it murmured. "You're already part of me." The shadows around her seemed to pulse with its every word, closing in like a suffocating fog. Her eyes darted around, desperately searching for anything to help her escape. The walls, the ceiling, the stairs. None of them offered any hope. The creature tightened its grip, pulling her closer, dragging her toward it. She tried to fight, tried to claw at its hand, but her strength was fading, swallowed by the unnatural cold. And then, in the midst of her panic, she remembered the key he had hidden so carefully. Her mind flashed back to the moment she had found it, before everything had spiraled into nightmare. Her only chance was to get to the key, but the creature seemed to sense her thoughts. It snarled, its voice a low growl. "Don't even think about it." Her body was numb, but she mustered every ounce of strength she had left. With a surge of adrenaline, she twisted her wrist, breaking free from its icy grip for just a moment. She bolted toward the crate, her legs barely responding, her breath shallow. The creature lunged after her, but she was faster now, desperation driving her forward. She reached the crate, her hands shaking as she scrambled for the key. Her fingers closed around it, its cold metal burning against her skin. As soon as she touched it, the room seemed to shift. The shadows recoiled, the air thickening, and the creature screamed. "No," it howled, its voice full of rage and fear. The key pulsed in her hand, vibrating with an energy she couldn't comprehend. She twisted it in her fingers, as though the key itself was alive. And then everything went dark. The darkness was suffocating, like being trapped underwater. She couldn't breathe, couldn't see. Everything had vanished into an oppressive void. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her body trembled uncontrollably. Then, slowly, a dim light began to form, flickering in the distance. It was weak at first, barely visible, but it grew stronger, brighter. She wasn't sure where she was anymore. The basement, the creature, everything seemed to have dissolved into nothing. The only thing that mattered was the key, still gripped tightly in her hand. Suddenly, a voice shattered the silence. "Leave it alone." The words were sharp, a command. She spun around, the light flickering against the shadows that crept around her. It was him, the man, the millionaire. His form materialized in front of her, as if he had stepped out of the darkness itself. His face was stern, eyes full of something darker than before. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. He took a step forward, but she held the key up in defense. He stopped, his gaze flickering to it, then back to her. "I never wanted you to find it," he muttered, his voice filled with regret. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Her grip tightened around the key, the sensation of its coldness seeping deeper into her skin. The shadows around them were alive again, crawling toward her, swirling like a storm. "You don't understand," he continued, his tone turning desperate. "That key, it's not just a lock. It's a door to something far worse than you can imagine." She didn't know what to say. She was lost in the chaos of his words, but the weight of them pressed on her chest. Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice breaking. The millionaire's face twisted in something between guilt and horror. "Because I had no choice," he confessed. "It was never meant to be you. I didn't know, but now I see." The air crackled with an energy that made her skin prickle. The creature, the thing in the shadows, was still there, its presence hanging in the air like a dark cloud. it wasn't gone. Not yet. The millionaire stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the key, then back to her. "You have to return it," he said urgently. "You have to close it again." The shadows reached out for her, a cold hand brushing against her arm. The key pulsed in her hand, almost as if it was calling to something. And then the creature's voice returned, louder this time, closer. "Return it, or there will be no escape." Her pulse quickened as the shadows continued to shift around her, closing in tighter. She glanced at the man, the creature, and back at the key. The pressure in her chest grew unbearable. Could she fix this? Could she undo the nightmare she had opened? Or had she already gone too far? The shadows pressed in on her, suffocating, like invisible hands tightening around her throat. The key in her hand pulsed with a relentless energy, its cold surface almost burning against her palm. The creature's growl echoed from every corner of the room, a sound that seemed to shake the very air. "You have no choice," it hissed, its voice filled with venom and hunger. "Return the key, or you will become one of us." Her mind was a whirlwind. Panic clawed at her. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a flicker of defiance. She didn't know what would happen if she returned the key, but she knew she couldn't let herself become a prisoner in this darkness. The millionaire, still watching her with a mix of fear and desperation, reached out, his hand trembling. "You don't understand," he whispered, as if pleading for her to listen. "If you don't close it, if you don't return it to where it belongs, everything will be lost." Her gaze shifted between the man and the shadows. The creature was getting closer now, its form shifting and undulating, a nightmare made flesh. Its eyes were gleaming with malevolent satisfaction, waiting for her to make a move. "Do it," the man urged, his voice cracking. "Hurry." With shaking hands, she raised the key, feeling its power pull at her like a magnet. She took a step forward, then another. But the moment she moved, the creature lunged, its gnarled hand reaching for her, the air around it crackling with dark energy. Without thinking, she thrust the key into the shadows, into the very heart of the darkness. There was an explosion of sound, like the cracking of 1,000 thunderclaps. The walls of the basement shook, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then everything went silent. The shadows froze, dissipating into nothing. The creature let out a final, terrifying scream before it vanished into the void, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of its presence. The air lightened, the oppressive cold lifting. The millionaire stood motionless, his face pale, as if he, too, had been released from a spell. She breathed deeply, the weight in her chest lifting. But as she turned to face him, the key dropped from her hand and clattered to the floor. It was over, the silence was deafening. The shadows that had once seemed to engulf the room now receded, fading into nothingness. The heavy air lightened, and the basement, once thick with terror, now felt almost normal, almost safe. She stood in the middle of the room, her breath still shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. The key, now lying cold and still on the floor, had lost its power. The creature was gone, and the man, he remained, but his presence felt different now. His eyes, once full of control and dark secrets, were now vacant, as though a weight had been lifted from them. She could feel his gaze on her, but for the first time since her arrival, she didn't feel like a prisoner. "I thought I could control it," he said, his voice low, hollow. "I thought I could keep it locked away, hidden from the world." His words hung in the air, heavy with regret. The basement seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the walls no longer pressing in on her. She took a step toward the man, her legs still shaky but her mind clearing. There was no more fear, no more confusion, only exhaustion and the realization that she had survived. You tried to warn me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with something like apology. "I never meant for any of this to happen. It was never supposed to be you." She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Instead, she looked down at the key, still lying on the cold concrete floor. It was over. The nightmare had ended. The door that had opened into darkness had been closed, and with it, everything that had come with it. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. The man didn't stop her. Without a word, she picked up the key and held it in her hand one last time. For a long moment, she simply stood there, feeling the weight of what had happened. Then, with a final glance at the man, his future now uncertain, his dark past behind them, she turned toward the stairs and began to ascend. Each step away from the basement felt lighter than the last. When she reached the top, she paused. For a moment, she listened to the quiet, the normal sound of the world outside, and then she stepped into the light.